Esther chapter 8, beginning at verse 1. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. And then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now, write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring can be revoked." At once, the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses raced out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was also issued in the citadel of Susa. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaisatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa were reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also." Lost my place. "And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on gallows." So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I've used this analogy a couple of different times in my tenure here, and where I'll call up a student, and I've got a glass of milk, and I've got some salt, and I tell the students, legend has it that a little bit of salt in chocolate milk makes chocolate milk taste better. And so I have the student try the chocolate milk on its own. I mean, a good scientific method, right? They try the chocolate milk on its own. And you put in a little sprinkle of salt and have them try it again. They give their opinion. Yes, chocolate milk is better with a little bit of salt. And then I say, who else wants to try this? And everyone's really excited to drink really good chocolate milk. And the next volunteer comes forward, and I say, okay, test the chocolate milk plain. And they do, and it's fine. And then I take the jar of Morton's salt, and I empty it into the chocolate milk and make them take a sip. Moral of the story is you can have too much of a good thing. Right? Too much of a good thing can kind of spoil the lot. And I think the book of Esther, as we come to the end here, has too much of a good thing. There are so many Christ figures that it can be tricky to follow. And if you try to chase everyone all the way to its end, you end up losing everybody. A people condemned to die by an unchangeable edict of the king, we can relate. Xerxes preaches us the gospel when he extends the gold scepter to Esther, not only in chapter 4, but also in our text this evening, reminding us that we have received mercy to approach the throne of grace in confidence. Or we see the gospel in Esther, who serves as a mediator for the covenant community of God as she stands before the king with favor. Mordecai is called the man the king delights to honor. Led through the city to be praised by the people after first humbling himself, bringing to mind the earthly ministry of Christ that began with his humiliation and resulted in his exaltation. But neither Xerxes nor Esther nor Mordecai ever sacrificed for the people. In fact, someone took Mordecai's place. So Haman preaches the gospel to us, taking Mordecai's place on the tool of execution, satisfying the wrath of the king. And what's more, we see in the opening verses that Esther and Mordecai receive the inheritance of the one who died for them. Did you catch that? Verses 1 through 3. But then again, Mordecai only comes into the presence of the king via Esther's mediation. And we read in verse 3 that it's his connection to Esther that results in his honor and receiving the king's signet ring. So again, the Christ figure shifted now back to Esther and to Mordecai from Haman. It gets tricky. We've got too much of a good thing. However we trace the gospel through the various characters in Esther, we can say this from the viewpoint of the Israelites in Persia. Those of us living apart from the law of God have an edict condemning us to death, repealed because a mediator whose life was pleasing to the king interceded for us, and because one died in our place, guarantees us our inheritance. All of that just from the story of Esther as we trace it through the various characters. Martin Luther describes the Christian's inheritance, turning our attention now to verses 2 and 3, what Mordecai receives by his connection to Esther. Martin Luther describes the Christian's inheritance using the example of a husband and a wife. We know from the New Testament that Paul uses Christ and his bride as an image of a husband and a wife, and we're right to reason from what Christ does for his bride, the church, down to how husband and wife interrelate. And Martin Luther very carefully reasons the other way and says, by looking at a husband and wife, what might we learn about God? You've got to be very careful when you reason from man to God, but Martin Luther, as he does it well. He says, in marriage, what belongs to the wife is taken on by the husband, and vice versa. What belongs to the husband is taken on by the wife. Just as in marriage, so it is with Christ and his bride. What belongs to us is taken on by Christ, namely our sin and brokenness. And we take on what belongs to Christ, namely his righteousness and status as heir to the throne. That is, we become sons and daughters of the King. What was ours now belongs to Christ, and what was Christ's now belongs to us. In the same way, what was Mordecai's now belongs to Haman, namely his place in death, and what belonged to Haman now belongs to Mordecai, his estate and his place in authority, possessing the king's very symbol of authority, his signet ring. But the story doesn't end in Esther 8, verse 2. It should, right? Someone has paid the price, they've gotten out from under Haman, and they've received all Haman's stuff. They're honored, they're wealthy, they've got power and authority, and the threat of death is gone. Where we should find rejoicing, we read in 8 verse 3, Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. We're reminded here that we live in a time in redemptive history full of tension. Christ has certainly defeated sin by dying on the cross. Christ has certainly defeated the grave by raising to life. And yet, we live in a time with wars and rumors of war, where brother betrays brother with the sword, a time with famines and earthquakes in various places. We sometimes refer to this time in redemptive history as the already but not yet. After redemption, after the cross, but before heaven. Already, Christ has already done it, but not yet. We don't have the fullness of the kingdom that we look forward to in heaven. We live in a time in redemptive history that we refer to as the already, but not yet. The book of Revelation pictures our time in the already, but not yet. Chapter 5 in Revelation introduces us to Christ as the Lamb who had been, past tense, slain. And Christ, for this sacrifice, receives worship of the people. Following this gospel presentation in chapter 5 are the opening of the 7 seals, 6 of which are pictured in chapter 6. So Christ is portrayed as the one who died for our sins in chapter 5, And then in chapter 6, he opens these 6 seals. Revelation 6 is where we are right now, the already but not yet. And it's in that chapter that we find the souls of the martyrs in heaven, saints who have gone before us and given their lives for the gospel. We find the souls of the martyrs in heaven have a response very much like Esther in 8:3. They say, "When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, 'How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?'" Just like Esther, who's on the other side of her rescue, of her redemption, says, "How long, King, will you let my people, my family, languish under this threat?" In our place in redemptive history, there is pain and suffering, injustice and anxiety. How do we, a saved people of God, process this? What do we do about it? Martin Luther would go on to say that just as we belong to Christ, so our neighbor ought to belong to us. We ought to take on what belongs to our neighbor, their hurts and pains, and what belongs to us ought to belong to our neighbor, that we might pass along this message and fruit of the gospel to people who need it. I think in this section, Esther and Mordecai, yet again, present us wonderful examples of how penitent, transformed followers of God live in and transform a compromised culture. Let me say that again. I think Esther and Mordecai in this section present us wonderful examples of how penitent, transformed followers of God live in and transform a compromised culture. We'll look at 3 ways to minister to our culture, 3 results, and then close with one important distinction. So 3 ways to minister to the world, 3 results of this ministry, and then close with one important distinction. First, take Esther's example and have hearts moved for the broken. Again, we found this in verse 3. Esther and Mordecai have been rescued. They have a rich inheritance. They have status before the king, and yet their heart is for the people who need rescuing. We need be reminded here that any edict of the king in this place in Persia is irreversible. Sure, Haman is dead, and the king is unhappy with his secret plan. We had learned back in chapter 3 that Haman had hidden the people group that he sought to annihilate from King Xerxes. If we look back at chapter 3, verse 8, he doesn't say, "The Jews' customs are different." Haman says, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom whose customs are different." The plot has been revealed, but this king is powerless to do anything about it. As was the case edict against Vashti, so it is in the edict concerning the Jews' annihilation. No edict of the king can be repealed. The edict still stands. The people still face the threat of annihilation on the 13th day of the 12th month. Esther's heart rightly breaks for these people. We, too, are heartbroken at the thought of one lost sheep. And the reality is much darker than that, isn't it? We've discussed the alcoholism shackling individuals and families. We're moved at the thought of so many children passing through foster care. Our hearts break for those who are lost in queer identities. Are we willing to take on their burdens that they might find refuge too? Esther, for the 4th time, sticks out her neck for the downtrodden. We so often look, and I've said this before, we so often look at chapter 5 when she first goes in before the king as this one singular moment of boldness in Esther. But repeatedly, she has stuck out her neck and made requests of the king. And here, verse 4 mentions again the king's gold scepter, as if the reader's forgotten that what Esther is doing here is risking her life. Esther is risking her life for the downtrodden. And I wonder if our hearts, and I'm preaching to myself as well, are moved for our city in the same way. How many of us feel what Esther feels as she pleads? How can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? So Esther and Mordecai get to work. And they do so with what feels to me like a little bit of arrogance. So we learn, secondly, to not fear the enemy. That our ministry is done without fear of the enemy. The proposal in Mordecai's edict seems to mock Haman. They've robbed his original edict almost word for word, almost entirely. I encourage you to open to chapter 3 now. We'll make some comparisons as we go along. The proposal almost seems to mock Haman. In the same way as Haman's, the script is written in every language. In the same way as Haman's, it's sealed with the king's signet ring. In the same way as Haman's original edict, it's sent out to every province, and it includes the use of the couriers. Only these couriers are faster. And these people get not a single day, but 2 days. And this edict is not arbitrary annihilation, but justified defense from attackers. And then I think the author takes another shot at Haman by including the date in chapter 8, verse 9, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month. We're reminded of Haman's hasty and haphazard hurrying. Just 70 days after he had secured victory, he had undone himself entirely. Such is the folly of worldliness. I think we've spent plenty of time there. And that number 70 is important, not just to Haman's folly, but to the restoration of these people. Jeremiah, remember all the way back, the first lesson in this whole series. Jeremiah had prophesied 70 years in captivity. Those 70 years had ended 50 years ago. And we wondered why these people had remained in Persia, seemingly opted out of God's plan of redemption. Or so it seemed. This new edict, after 70 days of threat, functions, I think, as a second chance for these people. It's as though Esther preaches to them, turns out it's not too late. God hasn't forgotten about us. This time we will respond. Esther, in doing this, preaches the gospel to the people. That God is still there and that God has grace enough even for these people who have shunned him so long. We learn, third, that this ministry is restoration via the gospel. In several ways, what we find the result of this text is restoration for these people. It gives them a second chance, as if the slate has been wiped clean. I want to call your attention back to 1 Samuel 15. Remember that this feud between Mordecai and Haman stems all the way back to Agag, King Agag, and King Saul, forefathers of those two men, of Haman and of Mordecai. Saul was supposed to put to death the Amalekites and not to plunder any of their goods. The story's in 1 Samuel 15. And what does Saul do? Well, he puts to death the things that are of no use to him, and he destroys the things that are of little value, but he spares King Agag. And he spares the best of their cattle and sheep, probably the best of their men and women. Keep some of the gold for himself, we're meant to infer. It's because the people plundered the goods that they weren't supposed to plunder that Samuel comes and says, Saul, the kingdom is going to be ripped from you. Interestingly, in mirroring Haman's edict in 3:13, this new edict of Mordecai gives the people the right to, this is 8:11, plunder the property of their enemies. But is this what happens? 9 verse 10 and 9 verse 15 remind or tell us, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. You see how this functions as restoration for these downtrodden and broken people. A chance to show God, this time we've opted in. Now, we have to clarify about how the law functions in our life. I'm not saying that their obedience this time has won them God's favor. No. We've been saying all along that this is not left up to chance, that God is writing this story, that God is sovereign over these people. God has redeemed them. But in this edict, he's given them a chance to show their love. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, Jesus tells us, right? Giving them a chance to demonstrate their obedience for this God who has reconciled and rescued them and say, this time, God, we're in. When we're motivated for the lost, and when we're without fear of the enemy, and when we do restorative gospel ministry, what is the result? We find 3, all tightly packed in Esther 8:15 through 17. First, we see how Mordecai is honored. And not only in 8:15, in 9:4, we see how his honor increases more and more, it tells us. When we do this kind of ministry, we are blessed. You could look back to Revelation and see John's writing to the churches that if they continue on in the gospel, they will receive the crown. Maybe some of you can reflect on experiences in mission trips where you've gone out to do ministry, and what does everybody say when they come back from a mission trip? I feel like I was ministered to more than the ministry I did, right? We come back full. We come back blessed for participating in this kind of gospel ministry for the downtrodden. Mordecai exemplifies that for us in some way. Second, we find that the city is transformed. If we look back at chapter 3 one more time, Haman's edict results in what in 3:15? The people in Susa are bewildered while Haman and the king sit down to drink. You remember that? What's the result of Mordecai and Esther's edict? A very different response, celebration and feasting. 8:16 says, happiness and joy, gladness and honor. And it repeats that over and over. Gladness and honor. The people celebrated, they had joy. The people celebrated, they had gladness, they had honor. In that little section, we're shown that these people, in receiving, I'll call it Christian, even though they're not Christian yet, right, in their place in redemptive history, receiving Christian ministry, they have increased happiness and honor and blessing. Our cities, too, experience this when we bring the gospel to them, when we minister reconciliation to them. I think it's right here to note that Mordecai and Esther do that via politics. We've got a presidential election, every election we should be voting in, but a presidential election especially so, coming up in a few weeks. And we wonder how our participation in politics can minister happiness and joy, gladness and honor to the people in our cities. Abortion, to name one. Right? We should be people who are participating politically to advance happiness and joy, gladness and honor to the downtrodden. And I don't know that there's anybody in our culture more downtrodden than unborn children. The result of gospel ministry, reconciliatory ministry, is benefit for the city. But this is more than mere social gospel. Third, we find that the gospel advances in the city, that people turn to the Lord. People from other nationalities, it says, became Jews. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit. We're kind of surprised to find 8:17 tells us they joined the Jews for fear of the Jews. Or if we look ahead to 9 verse 3, fear of Mordecai is the reason they helped the Jews. We would expect to find fear of God, wouldn't we? That they would reflect on what God is doing here, not fear of the Jews and fear of Mordecai. That feels like fear of man, doesn't it? And so we're right to wonder about the genuineness of these conversions. I'll give you both sides. One is presented by commentator Deb Reed. She thinks that these are false conversions. She writes, "Of importance is the parallel that this phrase creates with Esther's own journey. She chooses to identify herself with her people despite the risks involved. Now, non-Jews choose to identify themselves with Jews because they see only benefits from doing so. And this is certainly possible. And I imagine it's the case for many of these conversions. That they saw some cultural or financial benefit for siding with the Jews. We've seen very much the reverse happen in America in the last 50 years, haven't we? Wasn't that long ago that it benefited you to be a Christian? Your boss probably went to church and expected his employees to too. So it looked good. It benefited your relationship with your boss to be a member at a local church. It benefited your relationship with your family to be participating with their church. All right, it benefited you socially to call yourself a Christian. And as we live more and more in a post-Christian society, that's not so true anymore. And so we lament that droves and droves of people have left the church in the last decades. But all this exemplifies for us is that their conversions were false in the first place. That they were there for the cultural benefit, like many of these people may have been. However, I don't think this is the case for the majority of these conversions in our text. Because as yet, there really is no benefit to helping the Jews. The edict had given the Jews the ability to fight only against attackers. So if you're worried about this, all you have to do is not attack them. Instead, we find people actively helping the Jews. What's happening here, in my opinion, is the fruit of what we began to see in Haman's wife and friends. A recognition that the God of Israel is sovereign and powerful. Commentator D.J.A. Kleins writes, and I agree, their conversion to Judaism cannot be represented as insincere, for there is still no advantage to be gained by being a Jew. This fear must be a religious awe, such as falls upon the inhabitants of Canaan in Joshua 2:9, and Transjordan in Exodus 15:16, and Egypt in Psalm 105:38. This uninvited proselytism is presented by the narrator as the climax of the success story that has occupied chapter 8. When we do this kind of ministry, it results in our blessing, it results in the betterment of our society, and finally, it results in the advancement of the gospel, that lives are changed, that people get out from their brokenness because they've been rescued by our rescuer, Jesus Christ. Finally, I'll leave you with one key distinction. One key distinction. The story of Esther concludes with a last battle. Two warring peoples take up arms and duke it out until the victor is left standing. Something of the same story is said today of the end of this age. Dispensational eschatology is popular. Left Behind series. Some believe that when our time in redemptive history is over, so at the end of this already but not yet, the enemies of God will join forces and wage a cosmic last battle against the people of God. This idea is usually drawn from the imagery. We could find it in Revelation 16, 12 through 16, or again, maybe more clearly in Revelation 20, 7 through 10, where John writes, "When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. They march across the breadth of the earth, the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever." Here, once again, the story of Esther falls short in providing us a perfect Christ figure. Esther, Mordecai, and King Xerxes, even when they put their heads together, they're all powerless to secure an end for the people of God. They're all powerless to remove the edict of annihilation that hangs over the people. But thanks be to God that the perfect Christ figure has been revealed, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. His victory was completed on the cross, and so he's able to cry out, "It is finished." Christ is able to secure the victory for his people, that he might not lose one of those the Father has given him. Christ has, as Colossians 2 tells us, canceled the written code with its regulations that was against us and that stood opposed to us. Not just wrote a competing code, canceled the written code. He took it away, nailing it to the cross. Brothers and sisters, we are not waiting for a future victory to be worked out in the end. There is no last battle. The battle was won decisively on the cross and in the grave. The enemy is bound now and bleeding out. So, as the people after God's own heart, may we move without fear, bring the gospel to our city and to the ends of the earth. Amen. Let's pray.